For decades, conversations about racism have focused almost exclusively on the West. Europe and the United States are often placed under a microscope, examined, criticized, and pressured to confront their histories and present realities. But while the spotlight shines brightly in one direction, vast regions of the world remain in the shadows, largely unexamined, rarely questioned, and seldom held accountable. One of those regions is the Arab world. Across North Africa and the Middle East, millions of Afro-Arabs live ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary challenges. In markets, schools, workplaces, and even places of worship, many experience subtle exclusion, casual prejudice, tavisms, or deeply ingrained stereotypes that go unspoken and unchallenged. These experiences are not always dramatic or headline-grabbing. More often, they are quiet, normalized, and brushed aside as jokes, traditions, or misunderstandings. And that silence is precisely what allows them to persist. This story is not about pointing fingers or fueling division. It is about confronting uncomfortable truths that have been ignored for far too long. It is about examining how history, culture, and media narratives intersect to shape perceptions of race and how those perceptions continue to affect real people today, from overlooked histories to modern representation. This is a conversation many avoid, but one that urgently needs to happen. Why are these stories rarely told? Why do so many Afro-Arabs feel invisible in their own societies? And how did silence become the most powerful tool in maintaining inequality? In this video, we begin a journey into those unanswered questions. We peel back layers of denial, explore voices that are often excluded, and challenge narratives that have gone unquestioned for generations. This is not an attack, it is an invitation to listen, reflect, and understand. If you believe honest conversations matter, support this channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Your support helps bring hidden stories into the light. Let's begin. To understand why silence still surrounds the experiences of Afro-Arabs today, we have to step backward into a chapter of history that is rarely discussed openly, yet continues to shape attitudes, language, and social hierarchies across the region. Long before modern borders, oil wealth, or nation-states, the Arab world was deeply connected to a vast system of human trafficking that stretched across deserts, seas, and centuries. This past is not a distant footnote. It is a foundation upon which many present-day perceptions were quietly built. As trade routes expanded across North Africa, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, human beings became part of that commerce. Black Africans were captured or purchased, transported across harsh terrain, and absorbed into societies not as equals, but as property. Families were broken apart, identities erased, and lives reduced to labor, service, or status symbols. Over time, this system did more than exploit bodicit-shaped beliefs. Dark skin became associated with servitude, while power and authority became linked to lighter complexions. These associations did not disappear when slavery ended. They simply adapted, embedding themselves into social norms and unspoken assumptions. What makes this legacy particularly enduring is how rarely it is acknowledged. In many societies, this history is either softened, reframed as benevolent, or omitted entirely from public education and cultural memory. Without honest reflection, myths replace facts, and inherited attitudes go unchallenged. Generations grow up absorbing ideas about race not through explicit lessons, but through jokes, casting choices in television, casual language, and who is seen in positions of respect. Over time, these signals form a quiet consensus about who belongs at the center of society and who remains on its margins. This historical silence also explains why discrimination today is often dismissed as coincidence rather than pattern. When Afro-Arabs face exclusion or stereotyping, it is rarely connected back to the structures that created those dynamics in the first place. Instead, such experiences are treated as isolated incidents, stripped of historical context. Yet the emotional weight carried by those affected tells a different story, one shaped by centuries of inherited hierarchy and unprocessed trauma. The psychological impact of this legacy runs deep, being constantly associated with roles of service or dependency, while rarely being portrayed as thinkers, leaders, or heroes, can slowly reshape how people see themselves. Identity becomes something to negotiate rather than celebrate. For some, this leads to internal conflict, a quiet pressure to distance themselves from their own heritage in order to be accepted. These struggles do not emerge in a vacuum. They are the echoes of a past that was never fully confronted. At the same time, the broader society also inherits this history, often without realizing it. When old hierarchies remain unnamed, they continue to influence who is trusted, who is feared, and who is overlooked. This is why racism can persist even in spaces that emphasize shared faith, language, or culture. Unity alone cannot erase inequality if the foundations beneath it remain uneven. By linking the present to the past, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Modern discrimination is not simply a matter of personal prejudice or misunderstanding. It is the afterimage of a system that once normalized inequality and never fully dismantled its ideas. Acknowledging this connection does not assign collective guilt, but it does demand collective honesty. Only by understanding how history shaped the present can societies begin to imagine a future where dignity is not inherited by some and denied to others. This chapter of the story is uncomfortable precisely because it explains so much. And once it is understood, silence is no longer neutral, it becomes a choice. When slavery was officially abolished across much of the Arab world, it was presented as an ending closing of a dark chapter, a legal correction meant to draw a firm line between past and present. On paper, freedom had arrived, laws changed, markets closed. And the language of ownership disappeared from official records. Yet history does not vanish simply because it is outlawed. It lingers in habits, in assumptions, and in the invisible structures that organize everyday life. What remained after abolition was not chains, but something far more subtle and enduring: hierarchy. In the years that followed, societies moved forward without fully reckoning with what had come before. Slavery was removed as a system, but the ideas it produced were left largely untouched. The association between skin color and social position persisted, quietly reshaping itself into expectations about status, trust, and belonging. Formerly enslaved communities were rarely offered pathways to equal participation or representation. Instead, they were absorbed into social margins where visibility existed without power, and presence did not guarantee respect. This is how prejudice learned to survive without laws to protect it. It became normalized through custom rather than enforced through decree. People inherited attitudes without being taught their origins, repeating language and behaviors passed down as ordinary. Over time, inequality stopped looking like injustice and began to resemble tradition. When discrimination occurs in such an environment, it often goes unrecognized, not because it is invisible, but because it has been made familiar. In contemporary Arab societies, this legacy surfaces in everyday interactions that are rarely framed as political or historical. Who is expected to serve, and who is expected to lead? Who is portrayed as refined, and who is reduced to comic relief? Who is seen as fully belonging, and who is subtly treated as an exception? These patterns are not accidents. They are the social aftershocks of a system that once ranked human worth and never fully dismantled its values. The absence of open discussion has allowed these hierarchies to operate without scrutiny. In many places, race is treated as an external issue, something imported or exaggerated by foreign perspectives. This denial creates a paradox. Discrimination exists, declares, but naming it is considered disruptive. As a result, those who experience prejudice are often pressured into silence, while those who benefit from the status quo are free to believe it does not exist at all. What makes this especially powerful is how it shapes identity from an early age. When children grow up seeing limited and narrow representations of themselves, or hearing certain traits consistently linked to skin color, those messages settle deep. They influence confidence, ambition, and self-worth long before adulthood. Meanwhile, the broader society learns, consciously or not, who is expected to occupy which spaces. These lessons are not taught in classrooms. They are absorbed through repetition. The persistence of hierarchy also explains why progress can feel uneven. Legal equality may exist, but social mobility remains restricted. Visibility increases, but authority remains concentrated. Individual success stories are celebrated as exceptions rather than signs of change, reinforcing the idea that advancement is rare rather than deserved. In this way, inequality becomes self-sustaining, defended not through force, but through narrative. Connecting this reality to the past does not mean reducing the present to history alone. It means recognizing that abolition was a beginning, not a conclusion. Without intentional efforts to challenge inherited assumptions, societies risk carrying old structures forward under new names. The result is a world where freedom exists in theory, but dignity remains unevenly distributed. This continuation is not inevitable, but it is deeply rooted. Understanding how racial hierarchies survived the end of slavery reveals why silence has been so effective, and why change requires more than laws. It requires memory, honesty, and the willingness to question what has long been treated as normal. Only then can the distance between past and present begin to truly close. As the unspoken hierarchies left behind by history settled into everyday life, another powerful force stepped in to reinforce them. Media, film, television, and popular entertainment did not create racial bias on their own, but they gave it a familiar face, a voice, and a sense of normality. What had once been enforced through systems and customs began to be repeated through screens, scripts, and laughter, shaping how entire generations learned to see blackness within Arab societies. Cinema and television hold immense cultural influence in the region. They do more than entertain. They define what is considered respectable, humorous, threatening, or insignificant. Considic. When certain images are repeated often enough, they stop feeling like portrayals and begin to feel like truth. For decades, black characters in Arab media have been confined to narrow roles that rarely reflect the complexity of real lives. They appear as servants, background figures, or exaggerated caricatures, present but never central, visible but rarely humanized. One of the most damaging elements of this pattern has been the continued use of visual exaggeration and mockery. Performances that rely on altered appearances and distorted speech send a clear message about who is meant to be laughed at rather than listened to. Framed as harmless comedy, these portrayals often escape criticism, protected by the idea that humor cannot cause harm. Yet humor, when built on repetition, has a way of shaping beliefs far more effectively than open hostility ever could. What makes this especially troubling is how these depictions are rarely challenged within the societies that consume them. When audiences grow up seeing the same stereotypes repeated across decades, they become desensitized. The line between fiction and reality blurs, and social expectations begin to mirror what is seen on screen. Blackness becomes associated with inferiority, simplicity, or excess, while authority and sophistication are consistently coded in lighter tones. These visual cues operate quietly, influencing perception without requiring conscious agreement. The absence of authentic representation deepens the problem. When black actors and voices are rarely given space to tell their own stories, the narrative remains controlled by those outside the experience. This exclusion not only limits opportunity, but also ensures that stereotypes remain uncorrected. Without counter-images of intelligence, leadership, vulnerability, and complexity. So, the dominant portrayals continue to define the boundaries of public imagination. For young viewers, the impact is especially profound. Seeing oneself repeatedly reduced to a joke or a background role can shape how identity is understood long before words are available to question it. At the same time, non-black viewers internalize these portrayals as social cues, learning often unconsciously who deserves empathy and who does not. Over time, these lessons spill beyond the screen, influencing behavior in schools, workplaces, and public life. This pattern also helps explain why discrimination is often dismissed as exaggeration. When media presents biased images as entertainment rather than commentary, it becomes easy to deny their influence. Viewers may insist that these portrayals are fictional, even as the attitudes they reinforce appear in everyday interactions. The result is a feedback loop where stereotypes shape society, and society then accepts those stereotypes as reflection rather than construction. Connecting media representation to historical hierarchy reveals how deeply these narratives are rooted. The same assumptions that once justified inequality now reappear as punchlines or tropes. stripped of context but not of consequence, without accountability. Commissioned classism, entertainment becomes a vehicle for preserving old ideas under the guise of tradition. Breaking this cycle requires more than removing offensive imagery. It demands a shift in who is allowed to speak, who is allowed to be seen fully, and whose stories are considered worthy of attention. Until representation changes, the screen will continue to echo the past, quietly reinforcing the biases that history never fully left behind. When the weight of history and media narratives converges, their impact is felt most sharply in everyday life. For Afro-Arabs and Black migrants, discrimination is rarely a single event. It is a pattern woven into routines, opportunities, and expectations. It appears in who is welcomed and who is questioned, who is believed and who is dismissed, who is offered stability and who is left to navigate uncertainty alone. These experiences vary by country, but the underlying themes remain strikingly consistent. In many societies, Afro-Arabs are caught in a paradox of visibility without recognition. Their presence is undeniable, yet their belonging is often treated as conditional. Questions about origin, identity, or real nationality are posed not out of curiosity, but doubt. Over time, these questions chip away at a sense of home, turning citizenship into something that must be constantly proven. This quiet erosion of identity is one of the most damaging effects of systemic exclusion, because it transforms everyday interactions into reminders of perceived difference. Economic marginalization reinforces this divide. Access to stable employment, housing, and advancement is often shaped by informal networks and unspoken biases. Afro-Arabs and Black migrants frequently find themselves concentrated in low-paying, precarious jobs with limited protection, regardless of education or experience. These patterns are not always written into law, yet they operate with remarkable consistency, narrowing pathways and sustaining inequality across generations. When economic hardship becomes normalized for certain communities, it is no longer seen as injustice, but as expectation. For migrants, vulnerability is intensified by legal and social insecurity. Many arrive seeking safety or opportunity, only to encounter systems that limit mobility and amplify dependence. Without strong safeguards, power imbalances become routine, and exploitation thrives in silence. The fear of losing work, residency, or basic stability often discourages people from speaking out, allowing harmful practices to continue unchecked. In these conditions, survival takes precedence over dignity, and endurance is mistaken for consent. Country-specific contexts reveal how deeply these dynamics are embedded. In Morocco, everyday language and social attitudes often reflect a denial of Black identity within the national story. Afro-Moroccans are treated as outsiders in their own country, their heritage questioned and their history excluded from public discourse. In Egypt, media representation and employment patterns have long reinforced associations between dark skin and lower social status, shaping perceptions that spill into real-world interactions. In Tunisia, despite legal progress, Black citizens and migrants continue to face exclusion, under-representation, and, at times, open hostility. Particularly in areas where difference is most visible. These pressures do not exist in isolation. They compound. Identity erasure feeds economic marginalization, which in turn increases vulnerability to abuse. When individuals are consistently portrayed as lesser, their suffering becomes easier to ignore. Acts of violence, whether physical or verbal, are then framed as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of a broader problem. This framing allows societies to distance themselves from responsibility, focusing on intent rather than impact. The psychological toll of this environment is profound, constantly navigating suspicion, limited opportunity, and social invisibility requires emotional labor that often goes unseen. For many, the struggle is not only external but internal, involving questions of self-worth and belonging shaped by repeated exclusion. The pressure to assimilate, to remain silent, or to minimize one's experiences becomes a survival strategy, even as it deepens isolation. What ties these experiences together is not merely prejudice, but structure. Discrimination persists not because it is always loudly defended, but because it is quietly maintained. It operates through habits, assumptions, and systems that appear neutral while producing unequal outcomes. Why? Without acknowledgement, these patterns remain intact, passed down as normal rather than challenged as harmful. Understanding this reality requires looking beyond individual stories and recognizing the broader landscape they inhabit. Afro-Arabs and Black migrants are not facing disconnected struggles. They are navigating a continuum shaped by history, reinforced by representation, and sustained by silence. Bringing these connections into view does not simplify the issue, but it clarifies it. Only then does the full cost of exclusion become visible, not just in moments of crisis, but in the slow, persistent narrowing of possibility. As this journey comes to a close, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Meaningful change does not begin with denial, but with recognition. Racism does not fade simply because it is uncomfortable to discuss, and equality cannot exist where silence continues to protect injustice. The stories, histories, and lived realities explored throughout this narrative point toward a clear conclusion. Progress in the Arab world requires intention, honesty, and collective responsibility. Legal reform is one essential step. Laws alone cannot reshape hearts or erase prejudice, but they set boundaries that define what a society is willing to tolerate. When discrimination is clearly named and addressed through legislation, it sends a powerful signal that dignity and fairness are not optional values. Legal protections give victims a voice, create accountability, and help dismantle systems that quietly enable inequality. Where such frameworks exist, they must be enforced. Where they do not, their absence speaks volumes. Education is equally vital. What is not taught is often forgotten, and what is forgotten is easily repeated. Honest education about history, identity, and diversity can challenge inherited assumptions before they harden into belief. When young people are given a fuller understanding of the past and a more inclusive vision of society, they are better equipped to question stereotypes rather than absorb them. Education creates space for empathy, replacing myth with context and fear with understanding. Media accountability plays a defining role in this transformation. Stories shape societies, and representation influences how people are seen and how they see themselves. When media moves beyond narrow portrayals and embraces complexity, it has the power to disrupt long-standing biases. Responsible storytelling does not erase culture. It strengthens it by reflecting its full diversity. Changing what appears on screen can gradually change what feels acceptable off-screen. Beyond institutions, however, change ultimately rests with society as a whole. Recognition is not about blame, but about awareness. It requires listening to voices that have long been dismissed, acknowledging experiences that have been minimized, and understanding that equality is not a threat to identity, but an expansion of it. When communities choose to confront uncomfortable truths together, they create the possibility for shared dignity rather than inherited division. This conversation is not easy, and it was never meant to be, but it is necessary. Confronting racism is not a sign of weakness. It is a measure of maturity. It reflects a willingness to grow, to evolve, and to imagine a future that is more just than the past. Progress does not demand perfection, only commitment. So, thank you for taking the time to listen and engage with this story. If you believe these conversations matter and deserve wider attention, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Your support helps keep important stories visible and encourages honest dialogue. Together, awareness can become understanding, and understanding can become change. Understanding can become change.